So we are rushing through everything that can apply to a UK independent trade policy. Um, we talked about the WTO process, which is the multilateral pillar, the beginnings of the multilateral pillar, as part of UK trade policy, in our conception of what UK trade policy can look like. There are obviously three other pillars. One is what you can do unilaterally, what you can do bilaterally, and what you can do plurilaterally. We're going to be talking now about both the bilateral and the plurilateral pillar, which is basically what you can do with free trade agreements with other countries and high standards agreements with groups of like-minded countries. Um, and I have a great panel. Luis, I introduced before. John Weeks from Canada is the former Canadian chief trade negotiator. He was also the GATT council chair and the chairman of the regional trade agreements, the Council on Regional Trade Agreements, and in fact really developed the thinking in the WTO, in the GATT, on regional trade agreements, which is incredibly important, obviously, to the discussion that we're about to have, because any of these agreements that we're about to talk about have to pass muster under the WTO. That is why the WTO is the foundational architecture for international trade. So when we talk about these trade agreements, we are talking about things that are, deviations from your first best solution, which is multilateral trade liberalization. But to the extent that they are stepping stones towards deeper liberalization, then the WTO tolerates them and in some cases encourages them. So John has that experience and he serves on our Special Trade Commission. Alexander Downer, you all know, is the Australian High Commissioner here in London, but he was the longest serving foreign minister in Australia's history, I think. And so he has a deep and wide background that covers things like the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, the negotiations that Australia was part of in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and we'll be talking a little bit about those agreements as well. Luis, at the end of the conversation that we had on the WTO rectification panel, you talked a little bit about other agreements and the other things the UK can do and can perhaps catalyze. How would you, within the bilateral, obviously one of the most important agreement for right now is the agreement with the European Union, but we also have agreements that have been proposed from the US, from the Trump administration. There are the agreements we have through the EU with many, many countries, 40 or so EU agreements, of which 6 or 7 are critically important for the UK. And then there's our agreements with developing countries and the ACP countries. In terms of plurilaterally, we in our commission have argued for a high standards agreement amongst like-minded countries, a prosperity zone, where you would be able to deal with the barriers, the new barriers in international trade, which are in the services sector that Alan talked so eloquently about. Being able to make progress on those requires high standards agreements. The plurilateral piece of this is important because that's how you manage global supply chains, which can't be managed bilaterally. This is a fairly big agenda. How would you prioritize this agenda if you were advising Liam Fox today? What would you say?
Well, I'm not. So, so I'll tell you from our experience in Mexico. I mean, there's some parallel between Mexico's trade policy and potentially the UK. I mean, you might not realize it, but I think there is. I mean, we have a very large neighbor, as does Canada. We don't have a channel, but we have a river that separates Mexico and the US, potentially a wall one day. And Mexico was a relatively closed economy for a long time, decades or centuries. And one day we decided, after failing so many experiments, that maybe we should open up the economy, and to really send the signal that we wanted to true opening that will be lasting, we had to negotiate with the US. So we negotiated an NAFTA with Canada and the US. It's a very important agreement. But back then, we decided not to have a customs union with the US because that would have implied shifting the trade policy from Mexico City to Washington. And of course, given relative sizes, giving Washington our trade policy. So we decided not to do that. And in fact, the NAFTA became the perfect excuse to negotiate with other regions and made Mexico attractive for those negotiations. So you have, in my view, no option, as Crawford implied. You have to negotiate with the EU. I mean, that is what makes sense. That's where your integration is most important. And you have a lot to gain, and so do they, by the way, if there is a understanding of a modern, deep, ambitious agreement between the UK and the EU at some point. But it wouldn't stop there, because once you have that, you can do different things in different areas of the world. International trade, success in international trade is a matter not of working on your shortcomings or solving your problems. I mean, it's like a mirror. You wake up in the morning and you see a little more gray-haired, no, a little fatter, wrinkles, and you might get depressed. The key is not to find that mirror, your shortcomings, but your comparative advantages. Mexico has one comparative advantage internationally, which is we're the only large emerging market that can have simultaneously an agreement in North America, an agreement that is transatlantic with the EU, potentially with the UK, we hope, a trans-Pacific agreement with Japan, agreements throughout the Western Hemisphere in Latin America, and membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Our competitors can't. China will never get such a network. Brazil cannot get a network like that, nor do they want, by the way, or India, or Turkey, South Africa, South Korea, countries with whom we compete for investment. Well, the UK is in a similar position in the way that you are the only large economy, one of the top economies in the world, that can have an agreement with the EU, an agreement with the US and the NAFTA members, potentially an agreement with Japan, and even China, and then other places around. So if you want to be successful, you have to play on your comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is that we can differentiate ourselves from our competitors by negotiating these sort of agreements. Well, you have a similar situation in which now that you'll be out of the EU, you can negotiate with all these member countries and then become a leader in terms of how you shape up your trade policy and the world's trade policy. And that will differentiate the UK from everybody else, because no other large country of your size can have that network of agreements. And that's the way I would look at it. I mean, and in Mexico, that's why, and then once you succeed in doing that, these different initiatives tend to reinforce each other. I mean, the fact that we have an agreement with the EU today and with Japan prevents the US from quitting NAFTA. Because if they did, then the preferences that we give would be beneficial for Canadian companies, for Japanese companies, and for European companies. I mean, Donald Trump says he wants Buy America. Well, if we increase the Buy America provisions of the NAFTA, GE will lose and Siemens will win all the bids in the healthcare sector. So guess what? We are not going to change that provision. So by diversifying, you strengthen the key relationship that you have that will be with the EU will be strengthened by the fact that the EU knows that you will negotiate with other countries because it's a comparative advantage that others do not have. So that is the way I would think about how you develop your trade policy, which is based on your comparative advantages, which is what international trade theory tells you you should. And that's what we've been trying to do in Mexico in the last 25 years, and for the most part, I think quite successful.
Great. Question for John on sequencing. Because the Article 50 gun has been fired, we're obviously in a 2-year process of negotiations, both withdrawal and the terms of the new arrangement with the European Union, which we probably will not conclude in that 2-year period, and we will have some sort of interim arrangement. But there's a sequencing aspect to this as well, because if we wait, seems to me, and I'd like you, John, to react to this, it seems to me if we wait and then sequence these other agreements significantly after we have concluded or aligned whatever we have with the European Union, we will be locked in to European regulatory standards, European regulatory system. And that will then make it very difficult for us to negotiate any of these agreements that we've been talking about that go to Luis's point about comparative advantage of the UK, particularly in services. So what's your advice on sequencing, and how likely is that to occur? The NAFTA renegotiation process is also happening during this 2-year period. It's hard to imagine actually more happening in the trade world in the next 2 years. But that renegotiation period is going to happen. And there's been some discussion because of the US-UK relationship that some prospects for a NAFTA UK and North Atlantic negotiation. And you've talked about this, the Mexican Minister of the Economy talked about this on Monday. Can you talk to us a little bit about sequencing and how you would how you'd put this architecture together?
Well, thank you, and it's good to be here, and I must say it really is an interesting time in trade policy. I mean, Brexit itself would have made for a very interesting period of policy, but this was sort of compounded by the election of Donald Trump. Trade policy really in considerable flux, and it's not quite certain where it's going to land. In fact, I've said, you know, one of the really troubling things about looking at U.S. trade policy is now it's not clear to what extent the Trump administration really believes in the rule of law in terms of, well, sometimes even domestically, but in the international sphere. And I think, you know, that's particularly troubling. It's not clear if you were going to sit down with the United States today exactly what and negotiate a trade agreement, exactly what kind of trade agreement you'd come up with, you know, with this preoccupation, for instance, that Wilbur Ross seems to have on bilateral trade balances, that, you know, if the balance gets out of whack, then we ought to have another negotiation. So on the sequencing, obviously, as has been said already, your most important bilateral negotiation will have to be with the EU. But there are a lot of other countries out there in the world who are going to be very interested in negotiating a trade agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think as you negotiate with the EU, you need to keep very much in mind that you are going to need to keep some of your powder dry, because you're going to have to be able to have the wherewithal to negotiate later with other partners. Let me just give you one example, and we could have an endless technical discussion on these issues. But for instance, the precautionary principle in the sanitary and phytosanitary, we hear a lot about this, and in technical barriers to trade. If the United Kingdom were to negotiate an agreement with the EU in which you were to adopt and enshrine the European view of the precautionary principle, this would make it next to impossible for you to negotiate a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada and other countries particularly interested in agricultural exports. So I think what you should be doing is, of course, you engage with the EU, but I think informally, increasingly during this period, even over the next 2 years, you should start having not negotiations, but informal discussions. And what the boundary line between a negotiation and an informal discussion is, I'm not quite sure. But you need to have informal discussions with some of the other countries with whom you would like to have trade agreements, so that you can begin thinking about the design of these agreements after you leave the EU, and make sure that you'll be able to construct a framework of trade agreements that will make sense for you. Pretty formidable task, but I don't think it's one that's impossible. Now, again, on this sequencing question, if I was talking to Liam Fox, I'd say, you know, there's something to be said for the UK, particularly in the short term or the medium term, in looking at, can you join existing agreements rather than negotiate agreements from the very beginning? And so, as you said, it's an interesting time in the NAFTA. We're renegotiating the NAFTA. I like to call it modernizing the NAFTA. We'll see what actually happens. but at least the NAFTA's there. You know what it is. It's an agreement. Now, in many ways, I think it would make a lot of sense. There's an accession clause, by the way, in the NAFTA. It would make a lot of sense for the UK to join the NAFTA. From your point of view, too, it would mean you wouldn't have to sit down and start trying to figure out from de novo what a trade agreement with the U.S. would look like. You'd start with something that's already there. In the Pacific area, you know, we've seen the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations completed, the agreement signed, and then Trump withdraws. But you know, it's not quite clear that this agreement is dead. In fact, Australia and New Zealand have been urging people to have another look at it, and significantly now, Japan has basically never really quite let go of it. They've seen it, of course, as key to building their free trade relationship with the United States, but going well beyond trade as being geopolitically important in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of the role of China in the world and so on. Now, if Japan is actually serious, you know, originally Prime Minister Abe had said it wouldn't have any meaning without the United States, but now they seem to be changing their mind on this. And I think, you know, there's another agreement that could come into force with just 11 countries. And the U.S., of course, would be invited to join later, and well, they might. I think they probably would after they thought it through a bit more and saw what the dynamics and how they were losing out competitively as a result of not being part of that. But although it's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I mean, why not think of, from a UK perspective, of joining that? In fact, in many ways, the TPP agreement is already a modernization of the NAFTA because it involved the 3 NAFTA countries, and it's a kind of update of the NAFTA. So I think there are a lot of options out there. I think it's important for the United Kingdom to spend a bit of time thinking about how to get this right. But I think in many ways it would make sense to think of docking initially with some of these other agreements rather than trying to start at the very beginning and negotiate a set of free trade agreements with other partners from the beginning. I'll stop there because I know we don't have much time.
No, I think one can start to see a set of building blocks sort of emerging, NAFTA plus UK, and not only the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the UK could also accede to the P4. Australia has said, and I think Australia was one of the first countries to go to the UK and say we want a bilateral free trade agreement with the UK. Alexander, what's your take on the possibility of these kinds of interlocking relationships, and possibly if the TPP in 2 years is a viable agreement, how would Australia react to the potential for the UK to accede to that agreement?
Well, let me just start by saying something about how we come at these issues, which I don't hear much about here in the UK, and that is, what is your starting point? What do you want to achieve, other than trying to maintain in trade terms as much of the status quo with the EU as you can? We'll set that aside. In our country, we have a top-down approach to trade policy. Our top position, so, you can talk about the negotiations and the WTO and tariff rate quotas and how all this works, but what are you trying to achieve? So at the top, we don't know what our comparative advantages always are. What we think is that if we have an open economy, then that is going to maximize our GDP growth. We have an open economy. So essentially, we go to potential trading interlocutors and we say to them, we'll pretty much give you access to the Australian market, because it's our view, slightly counterintuitive this view, that if we get cheaper imports from you and we get stronger flows of investment, might affect in a negative way some individual industries in Australia, but overall our economy is going to be better off. So we're easy to negotiate with because we basically have an open approach. We happy to import, dairy products from Mexico, or beef, more realistically, from Mexico, even though we have a beef industry. We're happy to import sheep meat from New Zealand, even though we have a sheep meat industry, to ensure that our industry is always competitive and that, above all, it's not about the industry, it's about the consumers. So is this an important point and a relevant point? It's critical to the UK. Now, I heard in the previous session some talk about the UK going to be a gold standard in the WTO for trade liberalisation. I hope that's true. That will mean that the UK needs to enter into whatever sort of a whoever it wants to negotiate with, whether it's plurilateral, whether it's bilateral. It needs to enter into those negotiations with a view that basically the British market is pretty much open. If you turn up to negotiate a free trade agreement with Mexico, Canada and Australia, where the three of us are all in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if you turn up and say, yeah, we'd like to be in that, but, you know, we've got a very sensitive beef industry and we're not really sure about your access to all of our services sectors, and, you know, there are hill farmers in Wales and we've got to look after the sheep meat industry there and so on. The more you take that sort of view, the less easy you will find it to negotiate any trade agreements. So you need to have, and you've got an election coming up, so the parties can think about this in the lead up to the election. You need to think about what is your overall architecture going to be? What do you want to achieve? Now, it seems to us that if you decide that you are indeed going to be a free trading country and you will be an easy country to negotiate with, then it's probably best, I would imagine, to start off with a few sort of fairly modest bilateral free trade agreements to build a bit of a profile other than the EU itself. And in time build upon that. If you go straight into trying to negotiate new plurilateral agreements, you'll find that relatively complex. Because different countries, being reasonably mercantilist as they are, will always be looking for different types of trade-offs. So if you wanted to negotiate, say, with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, let's just take those three by way of an example. Australia has broader interests, and I've described our philosophy. For New Zealand, the real issue is going to be, you know, its dairy industry. That's a critically important export industry for New Zealand. Not so important to Australia. It's a tiny fraction of our export profile. And then for Singapore, the dairy industry, yes, you guessed it, they only import dairy products. For Singapore, it's just services. They're not interested in, or almost only services. They're not so much interested in other products. So it becomes a more complex type of negotiation, a plurilateral negotiation. I think you make a very good point about looking at joining existing structures rather than trying to set up new structures. I think that would be setting up new structures would be a laborious way to start. I think better to start with bilateral agreements and have a look at if there are other plurilateral agreements you might like to think of joining. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is 40% of the global GDP, if you include the United States, and even if you don't, it's still a big part of the global GDP. There are three countries. There's Japan, some of the, I mentioned Singapore, New Zealand, and so on, are all part of this. I think the TPP will go ahead myself. I think the switch in position by Japan is very promising. Abe has now, the Prime Minister of Japan, has now said he'd like the TPP 11 to go ahead. Could the UK join that? I mean, we wouldn't have any objection. The reason we don't have any objection is, look, if you want free trade with us, that's great. And how you achieve that, we're relaxed about that. So we wouldn't have any in principle objection to the UK trying to come alongside on the TPP. It's a very high quality agreement. But I mean, you know, first of all, I don't get a clear sense of where the UK is at in terms of what it ultimately wants to achieve with the rest of the world. The more committed to free trade you are, the easier you will find it to make trade agreements with other countries.
So there's an issue about plurilateral agreements sort of de novo, and then there's the issue of actually building what we've called in our commission a prosperity zone of like-minded countries where you're able to push the envelope on liberalisation. Doing that by acceding to existing structures and existing agreements, but not just simply to exceed and then to build on them. Because TPP, good as it is as an agreement, there are deficiencies in TPP, having negotiated it from the US side, that could be improved on, just as NAFTA, could be improved on. One issue we have in terms, and it's going back to the sequencing question, you talked about what country does the UK want to be. And basically what you're saying is we have to figure out who we are and what we want to be before we can figure out what our trade policy is going to be. Oh. And if indeed we want to be global Britain and open and all of these things, then that gives you a certain type of trade policy that opens the door to a lot of these things.
I just want to make one other point, can I? In this context, we're all alluding to free trade in goods and also free trade in services. But I have to tell you, the European Union and many parts of the world want to build into trade agreements a whole range of other issues, environmental standards, labour standards. You talked about the precautionary principle in relation to sanitary and phytosanitary standards. We might just call that quarantine. You build into something like quarantine standards the precautionary principle. You will find it hugely hard to make trade agreements with countries like our countries if you build all those things in. And so I just tell you this because it's really important to understand this in terms of you negotiating trade agreements with other countries. You need to make them simple. You need to have a clear objective. If you want to see labour standards changed in other countries, use other mechanisms. Use the ILO or some organisation like that. If you want to change environmental standards, go to the UN. But if you want to build all of those things into trade agreements, you will not make many trade agreements very fast. And then you can do that. I'm not telling the British what they should do. You can do that, but you just won't make many trade agreements very fast.
Right. And actually that follows very well from where I was going with the sequencing issue, because it isn't just the precautionary principle, it's standards, it's product regulation, it's a whole range of things. And the issue we have here is lock-in. So let's talk a little bit about a simultaneous negotiation, which looks like it is going to happen now, between the UK and the US, the UK and the EU, and the US and the EU in the context of the revived, potentially, TTIP. Having worked on the TTIP from the US side, the same issues that prevented TTIP from concluding are still present, and they are all regulatory issues and standards issues and so on. But do we not have an opportunity with that sort of triangulation of negotiation to enable the UK not to be in this dangerous position of being forced to lock in to European standards and regulation? Because the challenge we have is how do we not be locked in, on the one hand, but how do we also manage divergence in a way that our trade with Europe is disrupted as little as possible? That's the challenge we basically face. How does that triangle help us, or does it help?
Well, I think to start on that, I think you don't have any, it doesn't really matter whether it helps or not, because that's a situation you're faced with. So you're going to have to figure out how to do it. And I think, just to elaborate a little bit more on the North Atlantic dimension, which is billed as central to this panel. So we've got a situation now that you're looking at where Canada has negotiated a pretty good free trade agreement with the European Union called CETA, or the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, Economic and Trade Agreement. So, and that agreement is probably going to come into force provisionally, not all the provisions, because that will take a longer period of ratification, but most of the guts of it will come into force probably before summer of this year. So the UK will already have this trade agreement with Canada through the EU's CETA agreement. Mexico's in a similar situation, having a free trade agreement with Europe, which is now in the process of being modernizing. So you have a relationship with Mexico through this already. And then, of course, you've got the TTIP process in which the European Union has been negotiating with the United States, and the United States is now thinking about whether or not they want to re-engage that negotiation. You know, when you look at how the world works and how value chains operate, it would make a lot of sense, I think, from a UK perspective, to have one agreement with the 3 North American countries rather than 3 agreements with the North American countries, especially when the North American countries have one agreement with each other, because it would greatly improve the situation of the UK being able to participate in that marketplace more effectively. And I would add too, you know, I think the UK is in a good position here to bring a lot of good new ideas to the table, including, as was talked about in the first panel, really a rejuvenation of services trade, which is really what the future is going to be about in global trade terms. And I think, as Shankar was saying, you know, there's a lot of flux going on. I mean, we're in the process of modernizing NAFTA. It's the TPP is a brand new agreement. All these agreements have provisions that provide for the possibility of them being updated and expanded. In the WTO context, I don't think you really separate out any of this. There's not much going on right at the moment, but I really do think that we're going to see, as a result of a lot of factors we've been talking about, a convergence of thought within the next 5 or 10 years that we need to have a major new multilateral effort. And I think that one is likely to be quite different in character from what we've seen in the Doha round, because I think it will probably be founded much more on a new assessment of the basic economic interest of the key trading countries about the sort of global trade structure they want to see for the 21st century. We've heard a lot of talk about this, but nobody's actually sat down and done really serious homework, for instance, of the type that was done in the early 1980s in the run-up to the Uruguay round, when there was a lot of very serious thinking about what sort of world trading structure do we need to respond to the challenges as they were perceived then. We thought that was very modern back then, but of course, 1980 was a long time ago now, 40 years ago nearly. So it's time we did this again and had another look at it, and not make multilaterally the sort of, I would say, mistake we made of slipping into the Doha round without really thinking through what it was we really needed and wanted and having a clear vision of where we wanted to go. And I think that's the principal reason why the Doha round hasn't been successfully concluded. So we need to get that right. And I think all these things are interrelated. And I think there's actually a very important role that the UK can play in that in that whole field. You know, I was saying earlier, they're basically, when you look at the WTO, ironically, you know, think of it as the world's 160 countries. There are really only sort of 8 developed country voices in the WTO, because 28 of them at the moment are represented by one voice in the EU in terms of how things work and discussions. And then you've got, you know, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Switzerland, and Norway. And that's basically, you know, when you have a discussion of an issue, what you've got. And I think, you know, the addition of an independent UK voice in this process of global trade policy formation is going to be very important. And especially when the UK is, what are you, the 5th largest GDP in the world, something like that. I mean, this is going to be a big development. It's going to have a real impact. And if you play your cards right and bring leadership, people are going to be very responsive to that. And it's going to give the United Kingdom an opportunity to influence the evolution of the future of global trade policy in a way that I don't think people really started thinking about seriously until we realized that Brexit was upon us. What else?
We have time for one question. So I think there's a microphone coming up for you, is there? Or, and if you could just identify your name and affiliation, that would be great.
Roger Kendrick, and I'm an investor in a number of companies that trade internationally. There's 2 points that have been made today. One is what our objectives are in this whole renegotiation, and the other is that we shouldn't disturb what we already have with Europe. But actually what we have as a result of the single market and the free trade in goods is a deficit of about 90 billion with Europe. And that has grown up over the last 15 years, principally because of the undervaluation of the German currency and others. And that has damaged our GDP to the extent of about 6%, because when we have a deficit, our growth falls. And it's fallen by 6% over 15 years. So I think I would challenge the whole question of what we should be trying to achieve, because if we have these huge deficits and these huge imbalances, that is good for some countries, but it's not good for others. And whereas I understand that free trade is good for the world as a whole, there are big winners and losers. And actually the UK, in my view, has lost out substantially in GDP growth over the last 15 years. So can we come back to what the objective should be and not be just totally committed to keep what we have, because what we have isn't actually very good for us.
Yeah, so you're basically asking 2 questions. One is, should we be seeking to keep what we have? Because I think you've heard from the panel that simply seeking to keep what we have has dangers associated with it in terms of locking in a system that then prevents you from being flexible enough to deliver that consumer welfare gain. The other question you asked was the whole role of free trade and consumers. So if I can ask the free trade and consumers deficit question, Alexander, you talked about free trade, so...
Well, I don't think the economics is honestly right. You do have the highest rate of growth in the EU, so I wouldn't have thought you were going to custard here. I think you've been doing absolutely fine. And what does that tell you? That tells you that the analysis is wrong. You're just talking about your balance of trade with the EU, but you have to look at the total economic movements between you and the EU. So issues like investment, and this country receives something like 50% of all Chinese investment into the EU and about 50% of all Indian investment into the EU. So you have to take those factors into account when you look at trade balances in terms of the macroeconomic impact. And therefore, let me make this point to you. One of the reasons why Australian companies have historically liked to invest in the UK and Chinese and so on like to invest here is because you have a relatively open market. If you start getting into some sort of mercantilist game, I think we've heard this from the Americans recently, some mercantilist game that, oh, you know, we've got a trade deficit with Mexico, so we're going to have to rectify that. Why, and you know, start introducing trade barriers and so on. Why would anyone bother investing in your country? One of the reasons people will invest in a post-Brexit UK is because you will be, presumably, if you work out what your objectives are the right way, you will be a bastion of free trade and an open economy. And I mean, I have to say, you know, I've heard this from President Trump on occasions. The last thing you want to do is think about your trade policy in terms of whether you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit with some particular country or another. It is a path to protectionism, and I'd like to challenge anyone here to tell me what highly protected economy is a rich economy, and point to any very open free trading economy which is a poor economy.